Learning where to focus in landscape photography is essential to ensure sharp photos. And in this video I'm going to explain in simple steps how you can determine and set the right focus point in any situation. Hi, I'm Kim from Landscape to Art, and I'm here to help you improve your landscape photography by focusing on developing your skills as a photographer and less on the gear. If this is your first timer, make sure you click the subscribe button. Setting the focus right is something many photographers struggle with. It took me a long time before I learned the principles of focusing, and from time to time I still struggle with the focus in some scenes. So in landscape photography we often want everything from the foreground to the background to be sharp, and this is why it's so challenging. If you focus on the background, which beginners often do, you risk the foreground to be out of focus. And if you focus on the foreground, you risk throwing the background out of focus. Because of this, it's reasonable to believe that you have to focus somewhere in between, the foreground and the background. Before we continue, let's first look at an important definition related to focus: depth of field. When you focus a lens on a point, it's actually only one point that is 100% sharp, illustrated with this red line here. So this is 100% sharp, but there is an area in front of the focus point and behind the focus point that is also acceptable sharp, and that means it's sharp enough for us to use when we print and look at photos. And everything beyond will be out of focus. And this area between the nearest object to the camera and the furthest away that is acceptable sharp is what we call the depth of field. There are three factors that influences on the depth of field, and the first is focal length. The depth of field is narrower with a telephoto lens compared to a wide angle lens at the same aperture and distance to the subject. So generally it's much easier to achieve sharpness from foreground to background with a wide angle. And this is one of the reasons wide angle lenses are the typical go-to lens for a lot of landscape photographers. And the second factor that influences depth of field is the camera to subject distance. And it means the closer to the camera the nearest object is that you want to be sharp, the more difficult it is to get the background as well sharp. So if you struggle to get enough depth of field and you have increased the aperture, it's always you can try to pull back the camera a few centimeters. Just a small increase in the subject to camera distance will help a lot when your subject is extremely close to the camera. Another way to increase the distance to the nearest object when the foreground is very close to the lens is to raise the camera slightly higher. And with a wide angle lens you can tilt the camera slightly down and still include both the foreground and the background in the frame. But of course, in some situations when something is extremely close to the lens, it is not possible to get everything from the foreground to the background acceptable sharp. It doesn't matter whatever you try, it's not possible. And in these situations, the only option is to focus stack. And focus stacking is not a part of this video. The last factor that influences on depth of field is aperture. When you have set up the composition, basically both the focal length and the camera to subject distance is already set. So now the only option you have to increase or decrease the depth of field is to play with the aperture. What aperture setting you need depends on the actual camera to subject distance and the focal length you have chosen. In general, the smaller the opening of the lens, a bigger f-number, the more depth of field you will have in your composition. And typically when the foreground to background sharpness is what you're looking to achieve, an aperture in the range of f8 to f16 and even higher is required. With an understanding of how these three factors influence on the depth of field, you will have a much better chance to getting your image in focus. So now the next question is, where do you actually set the focus point? A typical beginner mistake is to focus in the distance when photographing landscapes. And this works fine if you're photographing an open scene like a vista or or a mountain in the far distance, and you have nothing included in the foreground. But if you have a main subject in the composition that really needs to be tuck sharp, obviously you must focus on that subject. And typically you always focus on the eyes when there is a person or an animal in the composition. But in most landscape photos there are many elements that must work together in a composition, and everything from the foreground to the middle ground and all the way to the background should preferably be in focus. And this last scenario is the most difficult and where many photographers struggle. Before we continue, I need to introduce another important term, the hyperfocal distance. Hyperfocal distance is the focus distance that makes both the foreground and the background equally sharp. And with the lens focused on the hyperfocal distance, everything from half that distance and all the way to infinity is acceptable sharp. But of course the challenge is to determine exactly where the hyperfocal distance is in front of you. There are several apps you can use to calculate the hyperfocal distance at a given focal length and aperture. And the PhotoPill apps is one of them, and which I use the most. But still the challenge is, how do you practically measure the actual distance from the camera to the hyperfocal distance point? And of course using a measuring tape or something similar is not practical when you are out in the field. But different photographers have different approaches to how they use the hyperfocal distance when they are out shooting. You just have to find the method that works best for you. And here are a few different practical approaches you can use to set the focus point. And method number one is to focus 1/3 into the scene. This method is based on the assumption that approximately 1/3 of the total depth of field is in front of the subject and 2/3 behind the subject. This is of course a rule of thumb, but it works in most typical landscape photography situations when you use the focal length in the wide angle range. A practical way to determine what is 1/3 into the scene is to enable the grid lines in the viewfinder or on the LCD. And most cameras have these grids representing like the rule of thirds. And now you can set the focus point on the lower line, the lower third, which is approximately 1/3 into the scene. The second option to set focus is to use the double the distance method. This is an easier way to use the hyperfocal distance principles because you don't have to calculate or measure the hyperfocal distance. After you have set up the composition, you look at the scene and decide which of the objects closest to the camera you want to be in focus, like these three. And then you double the distance from where the closest subject is and focus here. So let's say this tree here is at 60 centimeters from the camera. That means you set the focus at double the distance, so 120 centimeters. And then you will have an acceptable sharp range from all the way from the tree and all the way to the background at infinity. And all lenses have a fixed, a combination of a given focal length and an aperture has a fixed hyperfocal distance. And this is a real example. So with a focal length of 20 millimeter and an aperture of f11, the whole hyperfocal distance is actually 120 centimeters. And that means everything from 60 centimeters and all the way to infinity will be sharp in this scenario. So if you need even more depth of field, you have to stop down the lens even more, maybe to f16 or 18. Then you will increase the depth of field in front of the camera even more. In case you find it difficult to measure double the distance, it's always better to focus slightly in front of the hyperfocal distance than behind. Because if you focus behind, you risk that the background might appear a little soft. And the third method is to focus on infinity and pull back. With this method, you use the viewfinder or the LCD. And it's actually easier with an LCD and a live view because you can magnify the scene. So now you just set the focus point on the furthest away subject in the scene. And if you can see the horizon, focus on the horizon line. And then set the focus to manual mode on your camera or lens. And use the lens focus ring and pull back the focus until the distant subject just starts to lose sharpness. So don't go too far. You want to keep the background in focus. So theoretically, this focus distance is the hyperfocal distance. And the fourth method is to use focus peaking. Mirrorless cameras and some newer DSLR models have focus peaking. And if your camera have this option, it's a great way to figure out the right focus point. Focus peaking shows you a color overlay on the areas in the frame that are in focus. On my Nikon, I can use focus peaking directly in the viewfinder and also on the LCD. As I increase the aperture, I can actually see live how this affects the depth of field in the composition, because the red overlay moves with the focus. So focus peaking is an incredible effective way to focus, and it works all the time. So with all the different methods I have mentioned above, you should always check the focus after you have taken the photo. Use the LCD and zoom in close and on the image and check that the areas you really want to be sharp are sharp. And please keep in mind all the methods I have mentioned except for focus peaking works best with wide angle focal lengths. I hope you found this video valuable and that you now have a better understanding on how to focus your landscape photos. If you understand how camera to subject distance, focal length and aperture play together, it's a matter of using the right combination of them to get sharp photos. And with some practice you will soon start to nail the focus every time. Now, if you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching, and as usual, if you have any comments or questions, just post them in the comment section below. And until next time, ha det bra, goodbye.